Good evening, fellow travelers of America's hidden mysteries. Tonight we embark on a journey across our great nation, exploring the supernatural folklore that has grown from the very soil of different regions. From the Spanish moss-draped plantations of the Deep South to the wind-swept lighthouses of New England, from the vast farmlands of the Midwest to the rugged mining camps of the West, each corner of America has birthed its own unique collection of ghost stories and supernatural legends. These are not tales borrowed from distant lands, but spirits born from American experiences. The hopes, fears, tragedies, and triumphs that have shaped our nation's character. In each region, the landscape itself seems to have influenced the nature of its hauntings, creating a rich tapestry of supernatural folklore that reflects the diverse heritage of the American people. So settle back comfortably as we traverse the continent, visiting 6 distinct regions where the boundary between the living and the dead has always been remarkably thin. These stories remind us that America's supernatural heritage is as varied and fascinating as the people who built this nation, one haunted tale at a time. Story 1. Magnolia Grove Plantation, Georgia's Eternal Mourning. In the heart of Georgia's plantation country, where ancient live oaks create cathedral-like canopies over forgotten carriage roads, stands the ruins of Magnolia Grove Plantation. Once a grand estate covering thousands of acres along the Altahama River, the plantation was built in 1847 by Colonel William Hartwell, a wealthy cotton planter who spared no expense in creating what he intended to be a dynasty that would last for generations. The main house was a masterpiece of antebellum architecture. 3 stories of gleaming white columns, wraparound porches, and floor-to-ceiling windows that caught every breeze from the river. Formal gardens extended in all directions, with boxwood mazes, rose arbors, and reflecting pools that mirrored the Spanish moss swaying in the humid Georgia air. Colonel Hartwell lived here with his wife Margaret and their 3 children. Eldest son Thomas, who was being groomed to inherit the plantation; daughter Isabella, renowned throughout the county for her beauty and spirited personality; and youngest son James, a gentle boy who preferred books to the hunting and riding expected of young Southern gentlemen. The plantation's prosperity was built on the labor of over 200 enslaved people who worked the cotton fields, maintained the grand house, and crafted the luxurious lifestyle that the Hartwell family enjoyed. Their quarters, known as the Street, formed a small community behind the main house, where families lived, loved, and endured the harsh realities of bondage. The first supernatural encounter at Magnolia Grove occurred during the plantation's most prosperous years, in the spring of 1856. Margaret Hartwell was hosting an elaborate garden party for neighboring planters when guests began noticing a young enslaved woman in a blue dress moving through the crowd, offering refreshments with silent grace. What made this encounter remarkable was that several guests recognized the woman as Celia, a house servant who had died the previous winter from pneumonia. Yet here she was, apparently continuing her duties with the same quiet efficiency that had marked her living years. Margaret Hartwell, rather than being frightened by this revelation, was moved to tears. Celia had been her personal maid since childhood, more friend than servant, and Margaret had mourned her death deeply.
The appearance of Celia's spirit seemed to bring comfort rather than fear, as if their bond of affection had transcended death itself. Word of Celia's return spread throughout the slave quarters, where her appearance was seen as a sign that the ancestors were watching over their descendants. Other enslaved people began reporting encounters with deceased family members and friends, creating a rich tradition of ancestral spirits that provided comfort and guidance to the living community. However, the plantation's supernatural activity took a darker turn with the approach of the Civil War. In 1861, as Georgia prepared to secede from the Union, a terrible tragedy struck the Hartwell family that would forever alter the spiritual landscape of Magnolia Grove. Isabella Hartwell, now 18 and engaged to marry the son of a neighboring planter, received word that her fiancé had been killed in a duel over a perceived slight to her honor. Devastated by the news and overcome with guilt that the duel had been fought in her name, Isabella took her own life by drowning in the plantation's ornamental pond. Her suicide sent shockwaves through the entire community. In the deeply religious culture of the antebellum South, suicide was considered an unforgivable sin, and many believed that Isabella's spirit would be condemned to eternal unrest. Their fears proved prophetic. Within days of Isabella's burial in the family cemetery, her spirit began appearing throughout the plantation grounds. Unlike the comforting presence of Celia, Isabella's ghost seemed trapped in eternal anguish, forever reliving the moments leading to her tragic death. Visitors to Magnolia Grove began reporting encounters with a young woman in a white gown, wandering the gardens at night, weeping inconsolably and calling out the name of her deceased fiancé. The sound of her cries became so regular that the family eventually moved from the main house to a smaller residence on the property, unable to bear the nightly reminders of their daughter's torment. The Civil War brought additional tragedy to Magnolia Grove. Thomas Hartwell enlisted as an officer in the Confederate Army and was killed at the Battle of Chickamauga in 1863. James, despite his gentle nature, also joined the war effort and died of typhoid fever in a military hospital in 1864. Colonel Hartwell, broken by the loss of his children and the destruction of his way of life, died in 1865, just months after the war's end. Margaret survived until 1867, living alone in the shadow of her former grandeur, tended by a few loyal former slaves who chose to remain on the plantation despite their freedom. With the death of the last family member, Magnolia Grove began its slow decline into ruin. The main house fell into disrepair, the gardens became overgrown, and nature began to reclaim what had once been a symbol of Southern prosperity. But the spirits of Magnolia Grove seemed to intensify rather than diminish with the plantation's abandonment. Travelers along the river road began reporting increasingly dramatic supernatural encounters. The phantom sounds of a grand plantation ball could be heard echoing from the empty ruins. Orchestra music, dancing feet, and the laughter of guests who had been dead for decades, all celebrating in rooms where only kudzu and decay now reigned. Isabella's spirit evolved from a weeping presence into something more active and disturbing. Visitors reported being followed by a young woman in white who would appear suddenly in mirrors, windows, and reflective surfaces, her face twisted with eternal grief and accusation. The spirits of the enslaved community also became more prominent after the plantation's abandonment. Travelers reported seeing groups of people in period clothing working the abandoned fields, tending gardens that no longer existed, and carrying out the daily routines of plantation life as if the Civil War and emancipation had never occurred. Most disturbing of all were reports of Colonel Hartwell's spirit still attempting to maintain control over his lost domain. Witnesses described encounters with a stern figure in Confederate gray, patrolling the property boundaries and confronting trespassers with the authority of a man who refused to accept that his world had ended. In the 1920s, a northern industrialist purchased the Magnolia Grove property with plans to restore the main house and create a hunting lodge. The renovation work was plagued by mysterious setbacks. Tools would disappear overnight. Construction materials would be found rearranged in impossible patterns, and workers reported feeling invisible hands pushing them away from certain areas of the house. The project was abandoned after a worker was found unconscious in Isabella's former bedroom, claiming he had been attacked by an invisible force that left scratch marks on his arms and chest. The scratch marks, according to witnesses, spelled out a single word: leave. Today, Magnolia Grove Plantation exists only as ruins scattered through a second-growth forest. The main house has collapsed, leaving only the massive stone foundation and a few towering chimneys reaching toward the sky like the fingers of buried giants. Yet the supernatural activity continues unabated. Local paranormal investigators have recorded hundreds of hours of unexplained phenomena at Magnolia Grove. EVP recordings have captured voices speaking in period dialects, often discussing events from the plantation's heyday or expressing confusion about the current state of the property. Photography at the site consistently produces anomalous results. Figures in period dress appearing in images where no people were present, unexplained lights moving through the ruins, and shadows that seem to retain human form despite having no visible source. Visitors frequently report overwhelming emotional experiences at Magnolia Grove, suddenly feeling profound sadness, anger, or fear without apparent cause. These emotional episodes often occur in specific locations and seem to correspond with traumatic events from the plantation's history.
The most remarkable aspect of Magnolia Grove's supernatural activity is how it reflects the complex social dynamics of the antebellum South. The spirits seem to maintain the same hierarchical relationships in death that they held in life, with the Hartwell family ghosts appearing primarily in and around the main house ruins, while the spirits of enslaved people manifest mainly in the areas where the quarters once stood. However, there are also encounters that suggest a blending or equality among the spirits that would have been impossible during their lifetimes. Witnesses have reported seeing figures of different races and social classes interacting peacefully in the ruins, as if death had finally broken down the barriers that segregated them in life. Modern visitors to Magnolia Grove often describe the site as both beautiful and haunting, a place where the grandeur and tragedy of the Old South exist side by side in eternal tension. The Spanish moss still drapes the ancient oaks, the river still flows peacefully past the ruins, and the spirits of all who lived and died at Magnolia Grove continue their eternal dance between memory and forgetting. The plantation serves as a reminder that America's supernatural folklore cannot be separated from the complex history of race, class, and tragedy that shaped our nation. At Magnolia Grove, the ghosts tell not just individual stories of love and loss, but the collective story of a society built on fundamental contradictions that echo through time. In the end, Magnolia Grove Plantation stands as a haunted monument to the American South, beautiful and terrible,
grand and tragic, forever caught between the world that was and the justice that should have been.
Story 2. Pemaquid Point Light, Maine's Sentinel of the Lost. On a rocky promontory jutting into the fierce Atlantic waters off the Maine coast stands Pemaquid Point Light, a stalwart beacon that has guided mariners safely home since 1827. Rising 79 feet above the churning seas, this iconic lighthouse has weathered countless storms, witnessed thousands of homecomings, and mourned the ships it could not save from the treacherous waters that surround it. But Pemaquid Point Light guards more than just the rocky coastline. It harbors the spirits of those who lived, worked, and died in service to its guiding mission. The lighthouse and its keepers' quarters have become home to a collection of gentle ghosts whose presence speaks to the dedication, sacrifice, and enduring love that maritime communities have always embodied. The lighthouse was built during the presidency of John Quincy Adams as part of a federal initiative to improve navigation along America's dangerous coastlines. The location was chosen for its commanding view of the approaches to Muscongas Bay and the Bristol Peninsula, where countless vessels had floundered on the hidden ledges and unpredictable currents that made this stretch of coast a mariner's nightmare. The first lighthouse keeper was Ezra Mitchell, a former ship captain whose own vessel had been wrecked on these very rocks during a winter storm in 1823. Mitchell had lost his ship but gained intimate knowledge of the area's maritime hazards, making him the perfect choice to tend the beacon that would prevent others from sharing his misfortune. Mitchell served as keeper for 18 years, living in the attached keeper's quarters with his wife Sarah and their 3 children. The keeper's life was one of constant vigilance, maintaining the whale oil lamp, polishing the Fresnel lens, keeping detailed weather logs, and always watching for vessels in distress that might need assistance. The isolation of lighthouse life was profound, especially during the harsh Maine winters when storms could cut off the point from the mainland for weeks at a time. The Mitchell family learned to be entirely self-sufficient, growing their own food, making their own clothes, and finding entertainment in books, music, and the endless fascination of watching the sea in all its moods. It was during Mitchell's tenure that the lighthouse's first supernatural encounter occurred. In the winter of 1834, Sarah Mitchell was awakened by the sound of someone moving about in the lighthouse tower. Assuming her husband was attending to the light during a storm, she went back to sleep, only to find Ezra still beside her in bed the next morning. When she mentioned the sounds to her husband, Ezra revealed that he too had been hearing footsteps in the tower, always during the worst storms when the light was most critical to passing ships. The sounds were always the same, the measured pace of someone climbing the spiral stairs, moving about the lamp room, and then descending again. Rather than being frightened by these mysterious nocturnal activities, the Mitchells came to view them as helpful. On several occasions, they found that maintenance tasks they had planned to complete the next day had mysteriously been finished overnight. The lens polished to perfection, the lamp wicks trimmed, and the lamp room swept clean.
The identity of their invisible assistant became clear in 1841, when a visiting inspector from the Lighthouse Board brought with him the records of previous lighthouse construction in the area. Among the documents was a tragic account from 1826 during the lighthouse's construction. A master mason named Thomas Hale had fallen from the lighthouse tower during the final stages of construction, dying instantly on the rocks below. Hale had been known for his meticulous craftsmanship and his absolute dedication to the project, often working long into the night to ensure every detail met his exacting standards. The Mitchells realized that Thomas Hale's spirit had remained at Pemaquid Point, continuing his work of maintaining the lighthouse that had cost him his life. Rather than being a source of fear, Hale's presence became a comfort, and the family began leaving small tokens of appreciation for his assistance. A plate of food by the lamp room door, fresh flowers from Sarah's garden, or a bottle of rum on special occasions. When Ezra Mitchell retired in 1845, he passed along not only the keys to the lighthouse, but also the story of Thomas Hale to his successor, Keeper Samuel Burgess. This tradition continued through generations of lighthouse keepers, each learning to work alongside their ghostly assistant, and each adding their own encounters to the lighthouse's supernatural lore. The most poignant chapter in Pemaquid Point's haunted history began in 1889 with the appointment of Keeper William Carson and his wife Emma. The Carsons were a young couple deeply in love who viewed their assignment to the lighthouse as the beginning of a grand adventure together. Emma Carson was unlike many lighthouse keepers' wives. She took an active role in the lighthouse operations, helping with maintenance, keeping the logbooks, and even tending the light when her husband was ill or away. She also transformed the keeper's quarters into a warm, welcoming home, filling it with music, laughter, and the smell of fresh-baked bread. The Carsons planned to raise a large family at Pemaquid Point, but tragedy struck in 1894 when Emma died in childbirth along with their first child. William was devastated by the loss, and the lighthouse that had once been filled with joy became a place of profound sorrow. William continued his duties faithfully, but neighbors noticed that he had become a shadow of his former self, performing his tasks mechanically while seeming to listen constantly for sounds that never came. He began talking to his deceased wife as if she were still present, setting two places at every meal and carrying on one-sided conversations about the day's events. Local residents initially attributed William's behavior to grief-induced delusion, but visiting friends and relatives began reporting their own encounters with Emma Carson's spirit. Visitors would smell her famous cinnamon bread baking in an empty kitchen, hear her humming lullabies in the nursery that was never used, and catch glimpses of a young woman in white tending a garden where no living person was working. The most remarkable encounters occurred during storms, when Emma's spirit seemed to join her husband in tending the lighthouse. Passing ships reported seeing two figures in the lamp room during rough weather, a man maintaining the light and a woman beside him, both working together to keep the beacon burning through the worst conditions. William Carson served as keeper until his death in 1919, living for 25 years with the comforting presence of his beloved wife. Local residents reported that in his final years, William seemed to regain much of his former happiness, as if Emma's spiritual presence had provided the companionship he needed to find peace with his loss. When the Coast Guard automated Pemaquid Point Light in 1934, ending the era of resident keepers, many assumed that the lighthouse's supernatural activity would diminish. Instead, it seemed to intensify, as if the spirits who had devoted their existence to the lighthouse's mission refused to abandon their posts. Modern visitors to Pemaquid Point Light, which now operates as a museum and historic site, continue to report encounters with the lighthouse's ghostly residents. Thomas Hale's presence remains the most consistent, with maintenance workers and volunteers reporting tools that move by themselves, repairs that complete themselves overnight, and the sound of work being carried out in empty areas of the lighthouse.
Emma Carson's spirit provides a warm, maternal presence that seems particularly drawn to children and young couples. Families visiting the lighthouse often report their children speaking to an invisible friend who tells them stories about life in the lighthouse, while young couples find tokens of affection, pressed flowers, sea glass, or shells arranged in heart patterns, left in romantic spots around the grounds. The sound of music from the keeper's quarters continues to enchant visitors, with witnesses describing beautiful piano melodies and gentle singing that seems to come from the period when Emma Carson filled the lighthouse with her joyful presence. During severe storms, local residents still report seeing figures moving about the lighthouse, maintaining the automated beacon with the same dedication their living predecessors showed. The Coast Guard has investigated these reports multiple times, but has never found any evidence of unauthorized access to the facility. Professional paranormal investigators have documented extensive activity at Pemaquid Point Light, including electronic voice phenomena, EVP recordings featuring voices discussing lighthouse operations, weather conditions, and expressions of concern for passing vessels, all in period dialects and maritime terminology. Photographic anomalies showing figures in period clothing performing lighthouse duties, often appearing transparent but clearly engaged in specific tasks related to maintaining the beacon. Instrumental readings indicating presence and movement in areas where no living people are located, often corresponding with the sounds of footsteps, door openings, and other activities associated with lighthouse operations. The lighthouse's supernatural residents seem to embody the finest qualities of New England maritime culture: dedication to duty, concern for others' welfare, and an unshakable commitment to guiding travelers safely home. Their presence transforms Pemaquid Point Light from merely a historic structure into a living testament to the courage and sacrifice of those who devoted their lives to keeping the lights burning. Today, as automated systems and GPS technology have largely replaced the need for traditional lighthouses, places like Pemaquid Point Light serve as monuments to a vanished way of life.
The spirits who remain there represent not just individual stories of love and loss, but the collective memory of generations of lighthouse keepers who stood watch over America's dangerous coastlines. Visitors to Pemaquid Point often describe feeling a profound sense of peace and protection, as if the lighthouse's ghostly guardians continue their eternal mission of safe guidance. In the crash of waves against ancient rocks and the steady beam of the automated light, the past and present merge into a timeless reminder that some duties transcend death itself. Pemaquid Point Light stands as proof that the most enduring hauntings are those born not of tragedy or malevolence, but of love so deep and purpose so clear that not even death can extinguish them. In the lighthouse keeper's eternal vigil, we see reflected the very best of the human spirit, the willingness to serve others regardless of personal cost, and the enduring power of love to transcend all boundaries.
Story 3. Whispering Oaks Farm, Iowa's Fields of Memory. In the heart of Iowa's fertile farmland, where endless fields of corn and soybeans stretch to meet the horizon, sits an old farmhouse that has witnessed over a century and a half of American agricultural life. Whispering Oaks Farm, named for the massive oak trees that shade its weathered buildings, represents the archetypal Midwest family farm, a place where multiple generations have lived, worked, and died in harmony with the rhythms of the seasons and the demands of the land. The farm was established in 1871 by Nils and Astrid Johansen, Norwegian immigrants who joined the great wave of Scandinavian settlement that transformed the upper Midwest in the decades following the Civil War. Like thousands of their countrymen, the Johansens came to America seeking fertile soil and the opportunity to own land, something that had been impossible for them in the rigid class structure of 19th-century Norway. The original homestead consisted of 160 acres of prairie land, which Nils broke with oxen and planted with wheat, corn, and vegetables to feed his growing family. The farmhouse began as a simple two-room cabin, but as prosperity came and children arrived, additional rooms were added, creating the rambling, comfortable home that would shelter 4 generations of Johansens. Astrid Johansen was known throughout the township for her kindness and hospitality. No traveler was ever turned away from the Johansen table, and during the harsh prairie winters, the farmhouse served as an unofficial refuge for neighbors facing hardship. Astrid's kitchen became the heart of the home and the center of the family's social life, where important decisions were made, celebrations were held, and the daily rituals of farm life were coordinated. The supernatural activity at Whispering Oaks Farm began during the farm's early years, but in ways so gentle and helpful that the family initially didn't recognize them as paranormal phenomena. Astrid would often wake to find that bread dough left to rise overnight had been kneaded and shaped into perfect loaves, ready for the morning baking. Churning butter, one of the most labor-intensive farm tasks, would sometimes be completed mysteriously, leaving Astrid to discover fresh butter and perfectly cleaned equipment in the morning. At first, Astrid assumed that Nils was helping with these tasks, but when she mentioned it to her husband, he revealed that he too had noticed mysterious assistance with his work. Tools that he left scattered would be found organized and cleaned. Harnesses would be mysteriously mended overnight, and sick animals would show improvement after someone had apparently tended to them during the night. The identity of their invisible helper was revealed in 1879 when Astrid's elderly mother, Ingrid, came to live with the family during her final years. Ingrid had been known in Norway as a woman with second sight,
the ability to perceive spirits and supernatural phenomena. Within days of arriving at the farm, she announced that the family was being helped by the spirit of a Native American woman. Ingrid explained that the land on which the farm stood had once been home to a Sac and Fox settlement, and that a Native American woman who had died there before the white settlers arrived had remained to protect and nurture the land. This spirit, whom the family began referring to as the Guardian, seemed to approve of the Johansons' respectful treatment of the land and their generous hospitality toward others. The Guardian's presence became more pronounced over the years, especially during times of crisis. During the harsh winter of 1888, when blizzards isolated the farm for weeks and food supplies ran dangerously low, the family survived on provisions that seemed to multiply miraculously. Stored grain that should have been exhausted lasted months longer than expected, and the root cellar yielded vegetables that hadn't been planted there. The most dramatic example of the Guardian's protection occurred in 1893 during a severe drought that devastated farms throughout Iowa. While neighboring farms watched their crops wither and die, the Johansen farm somehow maintained enough moisture to bring in a modest harvest. Neighbors reported seeing a Native American woman walking through the Johansen fields in the early morning hours, apparently blessing the crops with water from a gourd that never emptied. As the years passed and the original Johansen children grew up and established families of their own, Whispering Oaks Farm became the center of an extended family network. Sunday dinners brought dozens of family members together in Astrid's kitchen, and holiday celebrations filled the farmhouse with multiple generations of Johansens sharing stories, music, and the comfortable chaos of a close-knit family. It was during these family gatherings that the farm's supernatural activity became most noticeable. Extra place settings would appear at the dining room table, as if invisible family members were being welcomed to join the meal. The piano in the parlor would play traditional Norwegian folk songs when no one was at the keys, filling the house with music that reminded the immigrant family of their distant homeland. Children in the family often reported playing with a nice Indian lady who would appear in the farmyard, teaching them about plants, animals, and the natural world around the farm. Adults who witnessed these encounters described seeing their children apparently engaged in animated conversations with someone invisible to mature eyes, but their children's detailed knowledge of nature and farming seemed to increase dramatically after these mysterious lessons. The Guardian's protective influence extended beyond the immediate family to encompass the entire farm community. During the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, which devastated rural areas across the Midwest, not a single member of the extended Johansen family became seriously ill. Neighbors who sought shelter at the farm during their illness often recovered more quickly than expected, leading to whispered speculation about the healing properties of the Johansen farmhouse. The most touching supernatural encounters at Whispering Oaks Farm involved the spirits of family members who had passed away but seemed reluctant to leave the farm they had loved. Nils Johansen died in 1921 after 50 years of working the land he had claimed from the prairie. Within days of his funeral, family members began reporting encounters with his spirit. Nils appeared most often in the barn and fields, continuing the work that had defined his life. His son Eric, who had inherited the farm, would arrive for morning chores to find that tasks had been completed overnight, animals fed and watered, stalls cleaned, and equipment maintained with the meticulous care that had been Nils' trademark. Astrid's spirit joined her husband's after her death in 1927, and her presence brought the same warmth and hospitality to the afterlife that had marked her earthly existence. Visitors to the farm would smell her famous cinnamon rolls baking in an empty kitchen, find fresh coffee prepared when none had been made, and discover that their rooms had been prepared with the attention to comfort that had made Astrid legendary throughout the county. The farm's supernatural activity evolved with each generation, adapting to changes in farming technology and family circumstances. When electricity came to rural Iowa in the 1930s, the spirits seemed to embrace the new technology, with lights turning on and off to guide family members through the household at night, and electrical equipment running more smoothly than similar devices on neighboring farms.
During World War II, when gas rationing limited travel and communication with family members serving overseas was difficult, the farm became a gathering place for supernatural encounters that provided comfort to worried relatives. Mothers and wives would report dreams and visions of their sons and husbands that proved remarkably accurate, as if the farm's spirits were serving as messengers between the home front and distant battlefields. The post-war agricultural revolution brought dramatic changes to Midwest farming, with larger machinery, chemical fertilizers, and new crop varieties transforming traditional farming practices. Some family members worried that modernization might disturb the spirits who had been such an integral part of the farm's success, but the guardian and the family ghosts seemed to adapt readily to progress that improved the land's productivity. However, the spirits did express disapproval when farming practices conflicted with their principles of land stewardship. Equipment would malfunction when excessive chemicals were applied, and crops would fail in fields that were overworked without regard for soil health. The family learned to balance modern efficiency with the traditional wisdom that their supernatural advisors embodied. The 1980s farm crisis that devastated rural America brought particular challenges to Whispering Oaks Farm. Low commodity prices, high interest rates, and changing consumer demands forced many family farms into bankruptcy, and the Johansons struggled to maintain the operation that had sustained them for over a century. During this difficult period, the farm's supernatural activity intensified dramatically, as if the spirits were mobilizing to preserve the land they had protected for so long. Visitors reported seeing entire crews of ghostly workers laboring in the fields, cutting costs and improving efficiency in ways that defied explanation. The farm survived the crisis, and family members credited their supernatural helpers with providing the guidance and assistance that enabled them to adapt to changing conditions while maintaining their connection to the land. Today, Whispering Oaks Farm continues to operate under the management of the fourth and fifth generations of Johansons, now supplemented by sustainable agriculture practices and agritourism ventures that bring visitors to experience authentic farm life. The supernatural activity continues, adapted to contemporary circumstances, but maintaining the same protective and nurturing character that has defined the farm's spiritual atmosphere for over 150 years. Modern visitors to Whispering Oaks often comment on the unusual sense of peace and belonging they feel on the property, as if the farm welcomes strangers with the same hospitality that Astrid Johansson showed to prairie travelers. Children are particularly sensitive to the farm's spiritual residents, often asking about the old-fashioned people they see working in the fields and gardens. Professional paranormal investigators have documented extensive activity at the farm, including electronic voice phenomena recordings featuring conversations in Norwegian, English, and what linguists have identified as Sauk and Fox languages, often discussing farming techniques, weather conditions, and expressions of care for the land and family. Photographic anomalies showing figures in period farm clothing working alongside living family members, often appearing translucent but clearly engaged in specific agricultural tasks. Instrumental readings indicating organized presence and activity in areas where no living people are working, often corresponding with completed tasks that family members didn't perform. The spirits of Whispering Oaks Farm represent the enduring values of Midwest agricultural culture: hard work, family loyalty, respect for the land, and hospitality toward others.
Their continued presence transforms the farm from merely a business operation into a living testament to the generations of Americans who built their lives around the rhythm of seasons and the productivity of the soil. In an era when family farms are increasingly rare and agricultural production has become dominated by large corporate operations, places like Whispering Oaks serve as reminders of the personal relationships between farmers and their land that once characterized American agriculture. The spirits who remain there embody not just individual stories of love and dedication, but the collective memory of a way of life that shaped the character of the American Midwest. Visitors to Whispering Oaks often describe feeling connected to something larger than themselves, a sense that they are participating in an ongoing story that stretches back through generations and forward into an uncertain future. In the whisper of wind through the oak trees and the gentle sounds of farm life continuing as it has for over a century, past and present merge into a timeless reminder that some bonds between people and place are too strong for death to break. Whispering Oaks Farm stands as proof that the most meaningful hauntings are those that celebrate life rather than mourn death, that honor continuity rather than dwelling on endings, and that remind us that the best of human values can transcend any barrier, including the boundary between the living and the dead.
Story 4. Silver Mountain Mine, Colorado's Echoing Depths. High in the Colorado Rockies, at an elevation of nearly 11,000 feet, the abandoned Silver Mountain Mine clings to a mountainside like a stubborn reminder of America's mining boom era. This collection of weathered buildings, rusting equipment, and tunnels carved deep into granite represents one of hundreds of mining operations that transformed the American West in the late 19th century, bringing dreams of fortune to thousands of prospectors, while extracting a terrible toll in human life and suffering. The Silver Mountain Mine was established in 1882 by the Rocky Mountain Mining Company after prospectors discovered a rich vein of silver ore running deep into the mountain. Within 2 years, a thriving town of over 3,000 people had sprung up around the mine, complete with saloons, gambling halls, a church, a school, and all the other institutions that followed mining strikes across the frontier. The town of Silver Mountain was a quintessential Western boomtown, rough, dangerous, and filled with men and women who had come west seeking their fortunes in the earth's hidden treasures. The population was as diverse as America itself. Irish and Italian immigrants fleeing poverty in their homelands, former Civil War soldiers seeking new opportunities, Chinese laborers who had completed work on the Transcontinental Railroad, Mexican miners with generations of experience in precious metal extraction, and freed slaves hoping to build new lives in the territories where the law, if not always the people, offered greater equality. Life in Silver Mountain was harsh and precarious. The thin mountain air made every physical task more difficult. Winter temperatures routinely dropped to 40 below zero, and supply wagons could only reach the town during the brief summer months when snow didn't block the treacherous mountain passes. But the promise of silver, trading at historically high prices in the 1880s, made these hardships seem bearable to people who had known poverty and desperation in their former lives. The mine itself was a marvel of 19th century engineering, with tunnels extending over 2 miles into the mountain and shafts dropping nearly 800 feet below the surface.
Steam-powered equipment hauled ore cars along tracks that followed the silver veins through a maze of passages that only experienced miners could navigate safely. However, mining has always been one of America's most dangerous occupations, and Silver Mountain extracted its toll in human lives along with its precious metals. Cave-ins, explosions, flooding, and equipment failures killed an average of 2 miners per month during the operation's peak years. Many more suffered from silicosis, a lung disease caused by breathing rock dust, which typically killed miners years after they left the mountain. The supernatural activity at Silver Mountain began almost from the mine's opening, but in a community where death was a constant companion, ghostly encounters were accepted as part of the natural order rather than extraordinary events. Miners routinely reported hearing voices calling warnings in the tunnels, seeing lantern lights moving through areas where no living miners were working, and finding that dangerous situations had been mysteriously avoided through intervention they couldn't explain. The most famous spirit of Silver Mountain was Patrick O'Malley, an Irish immigrant who had worked as a shift supervisor until his death in a tunnel collapse in 1885. O'Malley had been known among the miners for his uncanny ability to predict dangerous conditions in the tunnels, sensing when timber supports were weakening, detecting the presence of explosive gases, and knowing when weather conditions above ground might affect the stability of underground workings. After O'Malley's death, miners began reporting encounters with a figure in supervisor's clothing who would appear at critical moments to warn of impending danger. The ghost would gesture urgently toward unsafe areas, point out weakened support beams, or simply appear at tunnel intersections to guide lost miners toward safety. These supernatural warnings proved remarkably accurate. Miners who heeded the ghostly supervisor's guidance invariably avoided accidents, while those who ignored the warnings often found themselves in life-threatening situations. Within a few months of O'Malley's death, his protective presence had become so accepted that miners would automatically check for his approval before entering questionable areas of the mine. The ghost's most dramatic intervention occurred in March 1887, when O'Malley's spirit appeared simultaneously to multiple work crews throughout the mine, frantically gesturing for them to evacuate immediately. The miners, trusting their supernatural supervisor's judgment, abandoned their work and rushed to the surface. Less than an hour after the evacuation, a massive underground explosion, caused by a pocket of natural gas that had accumulated in the deepest tunnels, collapsed several major passages and would certainly have killed anyone remaining in the mine. The incident was so powerful that it shattered windows in the town and could be felt as far away as Denver, over 100 miles distant. The incident established O'Malley's spirit as the unofficial guardian of Silver Mountain Mine, and miners began leaving offerings for him, bottles of Irish whiskey, tobacco, and small personal items at a shrine they built near the main tunnel entrance. The shrine became a place of pilgrimage for miners from other operations, who sought O'Malley's protection for their own dangerous work. But O'Malley was not the only spirit inhabiting Silver Mountain. The town's graveyard, perched on a wind-swept ridge above the mining operation, became home to dozens of ghosts, representing the diverse population that had sought their fortunes in the Colorado mountains. Li Wei, a Chinese miner who died in a tunnel flood in 1886, became known for his ability to locate water sources and predict underground flooding.
His spirit would appear to warn miners when spring snowmelt or heavy rains threatened to flood lower tunnels, saving countless lives over the years. Maria Gonzalez, a Mexican woman who ran a boarding house in town until her death from pneumonia in 1888, continued her role as caretaker and protector of the mining community. Her spirit was most often encountered by miners' families, providing comfort to widows and orphans and ensuring that no child in Silver Mountain went hungry or cold. The children of Silver Mountain, who faced particular hardships in the harsh mountain environment, seemed especially sensitive to the protective spirits of Silver Mountain. They reported regular encounters with ghostly figures who would guide them safely home during blizzards, warn them away from dangerous areas around the mining equipment, and even provide companionship during the long, isolated winter months of the mining camp. The most touching supernatural encounters involved the spirits of children who had died in Silver Mountain but remained to play with the living children of the community. These ghostly playmates were described as friendly and helpful, teaching living children important survival skills while providing the companionship that was often lacking in the harsh, adult world of the mining camp. As Silver Mountain's prosperity continued through the 1880s, the supernatural activity evolved to include spirits who seemed to embody the town's collective hopes and dreams. Miners reported encounters with ghostly figures who would appear in the tunnels during particularly productive periods, apparently celebrating the community's success. The most elaborate supernatural manifestation was the Phantom Celebration that occurred every year on the anniversary of the mine's opening. Residents would report hearing music, laughter, and celebration coming from the town's abandoned buildings, as if all the deceased members of the community were gathering to commemorate their shared adventure in the Colorado mountains. However, Silver Mountain's prosperity was as fragile as it was dramatic.
The Sherman Silver Purchase Act was repealed in 1893, causing silver prices to collapse and making most Western mining operations economically unviable overnight. The Rocky Mountain Mining Company suspended operations at Silver Mountain in early 1894. And within 6 months, the thriving town had become a ghost town in the literal sense. Most residents abandoned Silver Mountain when the mine closed, seeking opportunities in other mining districts or returning to the cities and farms they had left to pursue their Western dreams. Buildings were left standing but empty, equipment was abandoned where it sat, and the mountain reclaimed what humans had briefly wrestled from its grasp. But the spirits of Silver Mountain seemed determined not to let their community die entirely. Travelers passing through the abandoned town began reporting supernatural encounters that suggested the ghostly residents were maintaining some semblance of their former community life. Visitors described seeing lights in the windows of empty buildings, hearing the sounds of daily life, conversations, cooking, children playing, coming from structures that had been vacant for decades. The mine tunnels continued to echo with the sounds of work crews, as if O'Malley and his supernatural miners were continuing their endless quest for precious metals. During the 1930s, when low silver prices and the Great Depression made mining operations even more challenging, several attempts were made to reopen Silver Mountain Mine. These efforts were universally unsuccessful, but not due to economic factors alone. Workers reported that the mountain's spirits seemed hostile to outside interference, with equipment mysteriously malfunctioning, tunnels flooding without apparent cause, and an overall atmosphere of menace that drove away even experienced miners. However,
When members of the original mining families returned to Silver Mountain, often descendants of miners who had worked there during the boom years, the supernatural residents welcomed them warmly. These family connections seemed to create a bridge between the living and the dead, allowing for communication and cooperation that outsiders couldn't achieve. World War II brought renewed interest in Silver Mountain's mineral resources, as the federal government desperately needed metals for the war effort. A military survey team spent several weeks evaluating the mine's potential, but their final report recommended against reopening the operation, citing unusual atmospheric conditions and unexplained equipment failures that made work impossible. Declassified military documents from the 1990s revealed that the survey team had experienced extensive supernatural encounters, including apparitions of miners in period clothing, disembodied voices warning them away from certain areas, and equipment that operated by itself during night hours. The military concluded that the site was unsuitable for strategic resource extraction due to unspecified environmental factors. During the 1930s and 1970s, Silver Mountain became a destination for counterculture visitors seeking spiritual experiences in abandoned places. These modern pilgrims reported profound encounters with the spirits of the mountain, describing visions of the town's former glory and receiving what they interpreted as wisdom about living in harmony with the natural environment. The hippie visitors seemed particularly drawn to the spirits of the diverse mining community, finding inspiration in stories of people from different backgrounds working together toward common goals. Several communes attempted to establish permanent settlements at Silver Mountain, but all eventually abandoned their efforts, apparently unable to coexist with spirits who had definite ideas about how their mountain should be used. Today, Silver Mountain Mine exists as a popular destination for ghost hunters, historians, and outdoor enthusiasts seeking to experience one of Colorado's best-preserved mining ghost towns. The Colorado Historical Society has stabilized some of the buildings and installed interpretive signs, but the site retains its wild, isolated character. Modern visitors consistently report supernatural encounters that echo the experiences of previous generations. Electronic voice phenomena, or EVP, recordings capture voices speaking in multiple languages: English, Irish, Gaelic, Spanish, Cantonese, and Italian, often discussing mining operations, weather conditions, and expressions of concern for visitor safety. Photographic anomalies show figures in period mining attire working alongside modern visitors, often appearing translucent but clearly engaged in specific tasks related to mining or town maintenance. Equipment malfunctions that resolve themselves when visitors show proper respect for the site and its former residents, suggesting that the spirits maintain territorial attitudes but welcome respectful guests. The most remarkable aspect of Silver Mountain's supernatural activity is how it reflects the democratic ideals that mining communities often embodied despite their harsh conditions. The spirits seem to have maintained the same egalitarian relationships in death that characterized the mining camp at its best: mutual aid, shared danger, and collective celebration of success. Professional paranormal investigators have noted that Silver Mountain's ghosts appear more interactive and purposeful than spirits at many other locations, as if their shared experience of frontier hardship created bonds strong enough to maintain community structure beyond death. The mine's guardian spirits seem particularly protective of visitors, with numerous reports of supernatural intervention preventing accidents on the treacherous mountain terrain. Lost hikers report being guided to safety by figures in mining clothes who disappear once the visitors reach familiar landmarks. Silver Mountain Mine stands as a monument to the courage, determination, and diversity that characterized America's western expansion. The spirits who remain there represent not just individual stories of adventure and tragedy, but the collective memory of communities that faced impossible challenges with mutual support and unwavering hope. In the howling mountain winds and the echo of footsteps in empty tunnels, visitors to Silver Mountain connect with a uniquely American story. The tale of ordinary people who ventured into extraordinary circumstances, seeking not just material wealth, but the freedom to recreate themselves in a land where anything seemed possible. The ghosts of Silver Mountain remind us that the American West was built not by lone heroes, but by diverse communities of people who supported each other through hardships that would have been insurmountable alone. Their continued presence in the Colorado mountains serves as eternal testament to the power of human cooperation and the enduring strength of communities forged in the crucible of shared struggle and common dreams.
Story 5. The Edmund Fitzgerald's Final Voyage, Michigan's Lake Superior Memorial. On November 10, 1975, the Great Lakes freighter Edmund Fitzgerald departed Superior, Wisconsin, loaded with 26,116 tons of taconite pellets, bound for Detroit. The ship, known as the Pride of the American Flag, was one of the largest vessels operating on the Great Lakes, stretching 729 feet in length and representing the pinnacle of freshwater shipping technology. Captain Ernest McSorley, a veteran of 44 years on the Great Lakes, commanded the Edmund Fitzgerald with a crew of 28 experienced sailors. The weather forecast called for gale-force winds and rough seas, but November storms were routine on Lake Superior, and the Fitzgerald had weathered countless such conditions during her 17 years of service. What happened next became one of the most famous maritime disasters in Great Lakes history, immortalized in Gordon Lightfoot's haunting ballad and forever etched in the collective memory of the American Midwest. The Edmund Fitzgerald and all 29 souls aboard vanished beneath the icy waters of Lake Superior during a fierce November gale, leaving behind a mystery that has never been fully solved and supernatural encounters that continue to this day. Lake Superior, the largest of the Great Lakes, has been called a graveyard of ships due to its treacherous conditions and the hundreds of vessels that have been lost in its depths over the centuries. The lake's immense size, larger than the state of South Carolina, creates weather patterns similar to an inland ocean, with waves that can reach heights of 30 feet or more during severe storms. The indigenous Ojibwe people who originally inhabited the Lake Superior region had long spoken of spirits dwelling beneath the waters, souls of those who had drowned in the lake and were unable to find peace. These water spirits, known as Memegwishi, were said to be neither benevolent nor malevolent, but rather eternally restless, calling to the living from their underwater realm. The Edmund Fitzgerald's final voyage began routinely enough. The ship left Superior, Wisconsin in the afternoon of November 9th in company with another freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson. Both vessels were bound for ports in the lower Great Lakes, carrying the iron ore that had fueled American industry for over a century. By the morning of November 10th, the two ships encountered increasingly severe weather as they made their way across Lake Superior. Winds reached 70 miles per hour, and waves grew to heights of 25 feet or more during severe storms. Captain McSorley radioed the Anderson, to report that the Fitzgerald had sustained some minor damage, lost fencing and a list to one side, but indicated that the situation was under control. The last communication from the Edmund Fitzgerald came at approximately 7:10 p.m. on November 10th when Captain McSorley radioed the Anderson with a routine message, "We are holding our own." Less than 20 minutes later, the Fitzgerald disappeared from radar screens, vanishing into the stormy darkness of Lake Superior without any distress call or further communication. The Arthur M. Anderson immediately began searching for survivors, but found only debris, life jackets, oars, and pieces of the ship's superstructure floating in the churning waters. No bodies were ever recovered, and the ship itself lay undiscovered on the lake bottom until the following spring. When the wreck was finally located in May 1976, lying in 530 feet of water, about 17 miles northwest of Whitefish Point, Michigan, it had broken in two sections, with the bow and stern separated by several hundred feet. The condition of the wreck suggested that the ship had suffered a catastrophic structural failure, but the exact cause of the disaster remained a subject of debate among maritime experts. What was not in dispute was the profound impact the tragedy had on Great Lakes maritime communities and the families of the lost crew members. The Edmund Fitzgerald had been more than just a ship. She was a symbol of Great Lakes shipping, a technological marvel, and home to 29 men who had dedicated their lives to keeping American industry supplied with the raw materials it needed. The supernatural encounters began almost immediately after the disaster. Within weeks of the sinking, other ships operating on Lake Superior began reporting strange radio transmissions, voices calling for help on emergency frequencies, using call signs and terminology associated with the Edmund Fitzgerald. The Coast Guard investigated these reports extensively, but could never locate any vessels in distress or identify the source of the mysterious transmissions. The voices were always described as professional and calm, as if experienced sailors were methodically reporting their situation, but the messages were fragmentary and faded quickly into static. Lighthouse keepers and Coast Guard personnel stationed around Lake Superior began reporting visual anomalies as well. The appearance of running lights from a large vessel in areas where no ships were operating, and radar contacts that appeared and disappeared without explanation, often in the vicinity of the Fitzgerald's final resting place. The most compelling encounters came from other Great Lakes freighter crews, who reported seeing what appeared to be the Fitzgerald sailing normally on Lake Superior, complete with her distinctive profile and the red hull that had made her easily recognizable throughout the Great Lakes fleet. These sightings typically occurred during storms or periods of low visibility, when crews of other vessels would suddenly see the familiar outline of the Fitzgerald appearing out of fog or snow squalls. The ghost ship would be visible for several minutes, close enough to read her name on the hull, before fading away as mysteriously as she had appeared. Captain Jim Hobog of the freighter Wilfred Sykes reported one of the most detailed encounters in 1981, 6 years after the disaster. While navigating Lake Superior during a severe storm, Captain Hobog and his crew observed what appeared to be the Fitzgerald sailing parallel to their course, approximately 2 miles distant. She looked exactly as she had in life, same red hull, same white superstructure, same configuration of lights. My crew was watching her through binoculars, and we could even see figures moving around on her deck. She maintained position for about 15 minutes, then just faded away like morning mist. The Coast Guard's investigation revealed that no vessel matching the Fitzgerald's description had been operating in that area at the time of Hobog's sighting, and radar records showed no contacts corresponding to the reported position. Similar encounters were reported by dozens of other ship captains over the following decades, creating a consistent pattern of supernatural activity that maritime folklore experts recognized as classic phantom ship phenomena. The Edmund Fitzgerald had apparently joined the ranks of legendary ghost ships like the Flying Dutchman, doomed to sail eternal voyages across waters where she had met her fate.
The 10th anniversary of the disaster in 1985 marked a significant increase in supernatural activity on Lake Superior. Multiple vessels reported radio transmissions that appeared to be communications between the Edmund Fitzgerald and the Arthur M. Anderson, apparently replaying the conversations from the ship's final day. These phantom radio messages were particularly unsettling because they included actual phrases and terminology from the documented communications between the two ships on November 10, 1975. The voices were described as calm and professional, discussing weather conditions, navigation, and the minor damage that the Fitzgerald had sustained during the storm. The supernatural radio transmissions were most commonly reported on November 10th each year, the anniversary of the disaster, leading many to believe that the crew of the Edmund Fitzgerald was somehow reliving their final voyage on an annual basis. Shore-based witnesses also began reporting supernatural encounters related to the Fitzgerald. Residents of communities along Lake Superior's shoreline described seeing lights moving beneath the lake's surface on clear, calm nights, patterns of illumination that suggested a large vessel operating underwater. These underwater lights typically appeared in areas near the wreck site and were often accompanied by unusual wave patterns on the surface, as if a massive object were moving through the depths. Marine biologists and underwater researchers investigated these reports, but found no natural explanation for the phenomena. The most poignant supernatural encounters involved family members of the lost crew, who reported visits from deceased loved ones in dreams and visions. These encounters typically occurred around the anniversary of the disaster and were described as comforting rather than frightening. Mary Champay, widow of crew member Oliver Champay, reported a series of dreams in which her husband appeared to reassure her that he and his shipmates were at peace. She told me they were all together, still sailing, still doing the work they loved, she said in a 1985 interview. He said they wanted their families to know they were okay. Similar accounts came from other family members, creating a consistent narrative of the Fitzgerald's crew remaining together in death as they had been in life, continuing their maritime service in some supernatural capacity. Professional paranormal investigators began studying Lake Superior's supernatural activity in the 1990s, using underwater cameras and sonar equipment to document anomalous readings in the vicinity of shipwreck sites. Their research revealed electromagnetic anomalies and temperature variations that suggested paranormal activity at multiple wreck locations, with the Edmund Fitzgerald site showing particularly intense readings. Underwater photography at the wreck site occasionally captured unexplained images, figures that appeared to be wearing maritime clothing moving near the ship's remains, lights emanating from areas where no electrical systems could function, and other anomalies that defied conventional explanation. The Great Lakes Maritime Heritage Center began collecting accounts of supernatural encounters from shipping personnel, lighthouse keepers, and coastal residents, creating a comprehensive database of paranormal activity related to Great Lake shipwrecks.
The Edmund Fitzgerald accounts represented the largest category of reports, reflecting the profound impact of the disaster on the maritime community. Modern shipping technology has not eliminated supernatural encounters on Lake Superior. GPS navigation systems occasionally register phantom contacts in areas where no vessels are operating. And satellite communication equipment sometimes receives transmissions that appear to originate from ships that sank decades ago. The most recent significant supernatural activity occurred during the 40th anniversary of the disaster in 2015, when multiple vessels reported simultaneous sightings of what appeared to be the Edmund Fitzgerald sailing near her wreck site. These encounters were witnessed by crews of several different ships and were documented through photographs and video recordings that showed an unmistakable ship-shaped anomaly on the lake's surface. Today, the Edmund Fitzgerald's legacy lives on not only in maritime history, but in the continuing supernatural encounters that remind us of the 29 men who gave their lives to Lake Superior's treacherous waters. The annual memorial services held at maritime museums around the Great Lakes include remembrances not only of the Fitzgerald's crew, but of all those who have been claimed by the inland seas. The ship's bell, recovered from the wreck site and displayed at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum, serves as a focal point for supernatural activity. Visitors often hear faint tolling sounds when no one is near the bell, and some claim to see translucent figures in maritime clothing standing near the display. The Edmund Fitzgerald's ghost ship sightings continued to be reported by Great Lakes mariners, serving as a reminder that some vessels become so integral to their waters that they continue sailing long after their physical destruction. These encounters comfort Great Lakes families while warning active sailors of the dangers that still lurk beneath Lake Superior's deceptively beautiful surface. In the end, the spirits of the Edmund Fitzgerald represent the enduring connection between sailors and the waters they navigate, a bond so strong that not even death can break it entirely. Their continued presence on Lake Superior serves as an eternal memorial to the courage and dedication of all who have made their living from the Great Lakes, and a reminder that some stories are too powerful to be silenced by the depths of even the greatest of waters.
Story 6. The Singing Spirits of Whispering Hollow, West Virginia's Mountain Memory. Deep in the hollows of West Virginia, where ancient mountains create valleys so narrow that sunlight touches the bottom for only a few hours each day, lies a place known to locals as Whispering Hollow. This remote mountain community, accessible only by a winding dirt road that follows Laurel Creek through dense forests of oak, maple, and pine, represents the heart of Appalachian culture. A place where traditional ways of life have persisted largely unchanged for generations. Whispering Hollow was first settled in the 1790s by Scottish-Irish families fleeing the coastal regions in search of land they could own and farm according to their own traditions. The hollow's isolation made it an ideal refuge for people who valued independence above convenience, and who carried with them the ancient Celtic traditions that would blend with Cherokee influences and African American spirituality to create the unique culture of Appalachian America. The name Whispering Hollow comes from an acoustic phenomenon created by the valley's unique geography. Sounds echo and carry in unusual ways through the narrow space between the mountains, creating whispered conversations that seem to emerge from the very rocks and trees. Local Cherokee had called the valley the place where the mountains speak, and early white settlers found the constant murmur of mysterious voices both comforting and unnerving. The supernatural traditions of Whispering Hollow began with its first families, who brought with them the folklore of their Scottish and Irish ancestors, beliefs in second sight, protective spirits, and the thin places where the world of the living intersects with the realm of the dead. These beliefs found fertile ground in the mysterious atmosphere of the hollow, where mist clung to the mountainsides and strange sounds echoed through the valleys. The McIntyre family were among the first settlers, establishing a homestead near the head of the hollow where Laurel Creek emerged from a series of natural springs. Hamish McIntyre, the family patriarch, was known throughout the region as a man with the gift, the ability to see and communicate with spirits. His wife, Moira, was renowned as a healer whose knowledge of mountain herbs and folk remedies seemed to come from sources beyond ordinary learning. The McIntyre's cabin became the spiritual center of Whispering Hollow, where neighbors came for healing, advice, and communication with deceased family members. Hamish would conduct what he called speakings, seances where the living could communicate with the dead through his mediumship abilities. These gatherings were not considered unusual or frightening by the mountain community. Death was a constant presence in frontier life, where medical care was non-existent, and accidents, disease, and violence could claim family members without warning. The ability to maintain contact with deceased loved ones provided comfort and continuity to families struggling to survive in the harsh mountain environment. The supernatural activity in Whispering Hollow intensified with each generation, as the spirits of the dead seemed to choose to remain in the place they had loved, rather than moving on to whatever lay beyond. The hollow became populated by multiple generations of ghostly residents, creating a community where the living and dead coexisted with remarkable harmony. The phenomenon that gave Whispering Hollow its greatest claim to supernatural fame began in the 1850s with the arrival of the Harmony family. Samuel Harmony was a circuit-riding preacher whose wife Rebecca possessed one of the most beautiful singing voices ever heard in the mountains. Rebecca organized the Hollow's first church choir and began teaching the traditional ballads and hymns that had been passed down through oral tradition for centuries. When Rebecca died in childbirth in 1857, her loss devastated not only her family but the entire community. Her voice had been the soundtrack to their spiritual lives, leading worship services, singing lullabies to children, and providing the musical accompaniment to weddings, funerals, and seasonal celebrations. 3 days after Rebecca's funeral, residents of the hollow began hearing her voice again, a clear, beautiful soprano singing the hymns and ballads she had loved in life. The singing seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the valley with perfect acoustics that made it impossible to determine its source. Rather than being frightened by Rebecca's continued presence, the community welcomed her ghostly performances. Church services were scheduled to coincide with her supernatural concerts, and families would gather on their porches in the evenings to listen to her ethereal voice carrying familiar melodies through the mountain air. Rebecca's spirit was soon joined by other deceased members of the community who had been known for their musical abilities. The hollow became home to a growing choir of spirits, each adding their voice to an increasingly complex supernatural symphony that reflected the musical traditions of Appalachian culture. The Phantom Choir included voices representing the diverse cultural influences that had shaped mountain music. Scottish ballads brought by the original settlers, sung in ghostly voices that carried the ancient melodies across centuries and continents. African American spirituals contributed by former slaves who had found refuge in the remote mountain communities, their voices adding depth and emotional power to the supernatural concerts. Cherokee songs that seemed to emerge from the mountains themselves, as if the land were singing the ancient melodies of its original inhabitants. The supernatural music of Whispering Hollow followed the seasonal rhythms that governed mountain life. Christmas brought ethereal caroling that seemed to float through the snow-covered valley. Easter featured triumphant hymns that celebrated resurrection and renewal,
and harvest time was marked by songs of gratitude and thanksgiving. The most remarkable performances occurred during times of community crisis, when the spirit choir would provide comfort and guidance through music that addressed the specific challenges facing the living residents. During the Civil War, when mountain communities were torn between Union and Confederate sympathies, the Phantom Singers performed patriotic songs from both sides, apparently trying to heal the divisions that threatened to destroy their beloved hollow. The Ghost Choir's most dramatic intervention came during the 1918 influenza pandemic, which reached even the remote mountain communities and threatened to devastate the population of Whispering Hollow. As families struggled with illness and death, the supernatural music intensified, with healing hymns and comforting lullabies providing round-the-clock spiritual support to the suffering community. Survivors of the pandemic credited the spirit choir with maintaining their morale and providing the spiritual strength needed to care for the sick and bury the dead. The ghostly music seemed to create a protective barrier around the hollow, and while many residents became ill, the death rate was significantly lower than in surrounding communities. The supernatural musical traditions of Whispering Hollow attracted the attention of folklorists and musicologists during the early 20th century, as scholars began documenting the unique cultural heritage of Appalachian America. Researchers who came to record traditional mountain music often reported hearing performances by invisible musicians whose repertoire included songs that had been lost for generations. Cecil Sharp, the English folklorist who conducted extensive research in Appalachian communities during the 1910s, spent several weeks in Whispering Hollow and documented dozens of ballads and folk songs that were performed by the Phantom Choir. Sharp's recordings captured not only the melodies, but also faint echoes of supernatural voices, creating what musicologists consider some of the most mysterious recordings in American folk music history. The Great Depression brought particular hardships to mountain communities as coal mining declined and traditional subsistence farming became even more challenging. During this difficult period, the spirit choir of Whispering Hollow expanded its repertoire to include songs of hope and encouragement, apparently responding to the community's needs with musical therapy that transcended death. New Deal programs that brought electricity and improved roads to Appalachian communities initially worried residents that modernization might drive away their supernatural musicians. However, the Ghost Choir seemed to adapt to changing times, incorporating new technologies when they served the community's spiritual needs. The Hollow's first radio, installed in 1938, occasionally broadcast phantom music that no station had transmitted, featuring the familiar voices of the spirit choir performing traditional mountain songs. These supernatural radio programs became legendary throughout the region, drawing visitors from distant communities who hoped to hear the ghostly musicians. World War II brought profound changes to Whispering Hollow, as young men left for military service and women took jobs in defense plants in distant cities. The spirit choir responded to these changes by performing patriotic songs and musical messages that seemed to provide communication between deployed soldiers and their families back home.
Letters from soldiers overseas often mentioned dreams and visions in which they heard familiar voices from Whispering Hollow singing songs that reminded them of home. These supernatural concerts apparently reached across oceans, providing comfort to mountain boys fighting in foreign lands far from the valleys they loved. The post-war period brought continued modernization to Appalachian communities, but Whispering Hollow maintained its traditional character and its reputation as a place where the supernatural world remained accessible to the living. The spirit choir continued to perform, adapting its repertoire to include contemporary songs while maintaining the traditional ballads that formed the core of mountain musical heritage. During the 1960s folk music revival, Whispering Hollow became a pilgrimage destination for musicians and folk music enthusiasts seeking authentic Appalachian experiences.
Many reported profound supernatural encounters, describing concerts by invisible musicians that featured songs and instrumental arrangements of extraordinary beauty and complexity. Professional recording equipment brought to the Hollow during this period captured numerous examples of phantom music, including performances by full orchestras of ghostly musicians playing traditional instruments, fiddles, banjos, dulcimers, and guitars with skill that surpassed any living performers. The 1970s brought increased interest in Appalachian supernatural traditions as paranormal researchers began documenting the unique phenomena of mountain communities. Whispering Hollow became a focus of academic study, with anthropologists and folklorists attempting to understand how traditional beliefs in spirit communication had evolved into complex supernatural musical traditions. Today, Whispering Hollow continues to maintain its reputation as one of America's most musically haunted locations. The community, now consisting of about 50 year-round residents, embraces its supernatural heritage while adapting to contemporary realities. Modern visitors to Whispering Hollow consistently report encounters with the Phantom Choir, describing musical experiences that range from single voices singing traditional ballads to full orchestral performances featuring dozens of instruments. The supernatural music typically occurs during evening hours and seems to respond to the emotional and spiritual needs of listeners. Professional paranormal investigators have documented extensive musical phenomena at Whispering Hollow, including high-quality audio recordings of phantom choirs performing traditional Appalachian music with period-appropriate instruments and vocal techniques. Electronic voice phenomena featuring individual spirits identifying themselves by name and discussing their musical backgrounds and connections to the mountain community. Instrumental readings detecting organized sound patterns and electromagnetic anomalies that correspond with reported supernatural musical performances. The spirit choir of Whispering Hollow represents the enduring power of music to transcend death and connect communities across generations. The phantom musicians embody the values and traditions of Appalachian culture, family loyalty, spiritual faith, and the belief that music can heal, comfort, and unite people in ways that ordinary communication cannot achieve. In an era when traditional mountain communities face challenges from economic change and cultural homogenization, places like Whispering Hollow serve as repositories of authentic Appalachian heritage. The supernatural musicians who continue to perform there remind us that some cultural traditions are too powerful to be silenced by death or diminished by time. Visitors to Whispering Hollow often feel connected to something larger than themselves, a sense that they are participating in an ongoing conversation between past and present, between the living and the dead, mediated by music that speaks to the deepest human experiences of love, loss, hope, and belonging. The singing spirits of Whispering Hollow prove that the most meaningful hauntings are those that celebrate rather than frighten, that unite rather than divide, and that remind us that the best of human culture, our music, our stories, our connections to each other, can survive any boundary, including the ultimate boundary between life and death. In the echo of phantom voices singing ancient ballads through mountain mists, we hear not just the ghosts of individual people, but the collective soul of a culture that has always understood that music is the language of the spirit, capable of carrying our deepest truths across any distance, through any darkness, and beyond any ending.